When I was a young pastor and I first heard about pregnancy resource centers, I said, well, they weren't called that then. There were only 12 crisis pregnancy centers then with the Christian Action Council that later became CareNet in the country, and they were back east, but I was invited to have some people come to our church who had just started one in Portland, the first pregnancy center in the Pacific Northwest. And I said, sounds good. It was different. I wasn't sure how our people were going to respond. They came, and one of the women who was on the board of this group, one of the founders of it, told her story. And it was the first time I ever heard a woman publicly tell her abortion story. And I found myself weeping, and many others of us in the church were weeping, because this woman was telling her story, and she said, I knew no alternative, none. I had this abortion, and I have lived with it. I've lived with the guilt of it, and yes, I found forgiveness in Jesus, but there are still great consequences and regrets that have come out of this situation. I was asked to be on the board of that pregnancy center a few years later, but something else happened in the meantime. Nancy and I, in 1980, when our oldest daughter, Karina, who's here tonight, Karina Franklin, we didn't call her Karina Franklin then, we called her just Karina in our family, but she lives down here now, married to Dan Franklin, one of the pastors at Life Bible Fellowship, and when Karina was just a year and a half, we opened our home to Diane, and Diane was 18 years old, and she'd been kicked out of her home, and she'd been living with a guy, and it was a bad situation. We opened our home to her. It turns out she was pregnant. She had had an abortion in the past. We learned of as time went on, and then we helped her place the child that she gave birth to into a Christian home for adoption, and just this last year had the privilege of being there when she was reunited with the child she placed for adoption, who then was 33 years old, the age of our younger daughter, Angela. So one of the great privileges of having Diane with us was that she came to faith in Christ living in our home. And so we didn't view concern about a person who had needs. We didn't confuse concern when we found out she was pregnant about the life of her then unborn child. We didn't confuse that as somehow not being part of the Great Commission. Diane came to Christ as she lived in our home, and has become a person who has won many, many women to Christ, goes into prisons, leads Bible studies, does abortion counseling with women in jails. And Diane, as she lived with us, was not an easy time. Nancy will attest to that. It was very difficult because of her background and many of the things she did when she lived with us. But after she came to Christ and the years that went on, she became very, very close, like another family member, something between a daughter and a sister to us, and she's precious to us to this very day. Once again, not disconnected from the Great Commission.